The night trouble arrived at Martha's Bakery. The moon hung low over Los Angeles, casting an eerie glow over the quiet streets of Oakwood, a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The hum of streetlights and the distant sound of a motorcycle engine revving echoed through the near-empty sidewalks. Inside Martha's Sweet Haven, a small warm bakery nestled between a tailor shop and a florist, 72-year-old Martha Caldwell swept the last few crumbs from the floor. The place smelled of freshly baked cinnamon rolls and the faint hint of vanilla, a scent that had drawn in customers for the past 4 decades. This wasn't just a bakery. It was her husband's dream. A dream she had kept alive even after he passed, waking up before sunrise every morning to mix dough, knead bread, and roll pastries, all for the people who had come to love her like family. But tonight was different, because tonight they came back. The sound that shattered everything. Martha had just turned off the main lights, ready to close for the night, when the shattering crash of glass erupted through the front window. Her heart leaked to her throat as tiny shards of broken glass skidded across the floor, glinting under the dim glow of the neon open sign that now flickered ominously. And then they stepped in. A group of bikers, clad in black leather jackets, boots caked in dust, and tattoos creeping up their arms like venomous vines, strode inside as if they owned the place. The Iron Fangs, a gang notorious for extortion, vandalism, and intimidation. Their leader, a towering man with a jagged scar running from his temple to his cheekbone, stepped forward and slammed a heavy fist on the counter, causing a display of delicate pastries to tremble. "You want to keep your little bakery open, lady." His voice was low, gravelly, dangerous. "Then you start paying us, or we start breaking more than just windows." Martha's hands shook as she gripped the broomstick tighter. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've told you, I can't afford to pay protection money. I barely make enough to keep this place running." The gang leader, Axel, grinned, a cruel, amused expression. "That ain't my problem, sweetheart." He turned to one of his men. "Boys, maybe we need to leave a bigger message this time." One of the bikers grabbed a tray of cupcakes, smirking as he crushed them in his fist. Another one knocked over a chair, the wooden legs scraping against the floor like nails on a chalkboard. Martha's heart pounded in her chest. But outside, someone was watching. The arrival of an unexpected hero. A few doors down, a black 1968 Ford Mustang Fastback pulled to a stop at the curb. Keanu Reeves had just returned from a Pearl Jam concert at the Hollywood Bowl, the music still ringing in his ears as he parked his car and stepped out, stretching from the long drive. He had been craving a late-night coffee, hoping to grab one from the corner cafe. But before he could cross the street, something caught his eye. A shattered bakery window. Inside, he saw a group of men looming over an elderly woman, their postures radiating intimidation, arrogance, and unchecked cruelty. Keanu's jaw tightened. Something wasn't right. Adjusting his leather jacket, he crossed the street, his boots making soft but steady thuds against the pavement. He could hear the muffled voices from inside now. Threats, mocking laughter, a woman's voice, wavering, pleading. He didn't hesitate. Keanu pushed open the door. The moment everything changed. The bikers turned immediately, their sneers fading the moment they recognized him. One of them muttered under his breath, "No way, it's that." Keanu's piercing dark eyes locked onto Axel, his posture calm yet undeniably commanding. "Is there a problem here?" The question was simple, but the weight behind it, it could crush mountains. Axel took a slow step forward, sizing up the man before him. His scarred lip curled into a smirk. "Stay out of this, old man. This ain't your business." Keanu didn't blink. "It is now." The room went dead silent. Axel let out a mocking chuckle, turning to his crew. "Oh, look at this. Hollywood royalty's here to play hero." He turned back to Keanu, cracking his knuckles. "Listen, Mr. Movie Star, Why don't you go back to your fancy car and let the grown-ups handle business? Keanu's eyes didn't waver. You're gonna leave, he said, his voice steady, quiet, but laced with steel. Axel raised an eyebrow. Oh yeah. He took a step closer, getting right in Keanu's face. And what if we don't? Keanu tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then he smiled. Not the friendly kind. The kind that made even the most fearless men feel the first stirrings of doubt. At that moment, something shifted in the room. Axel felt it. His men felt it. And Martha, she held her breath, watching the scene unfold, realizing that maybe, just maybe, her nightmare was finally over. Because Keanu Reeves wasn't just an actor. He was a man who had seen darkness, who had endured pain and loss, and who had never once backed down from injustice. And tonight, he wasn't backing down. The showdown that no one expected. The air inside Martha's sweet haven grew thick with tension, the scent of cinnamon and vanilla now overshadowed by something far less sweet, the electric charge of an impending fight. Axel, the scar-faced leader of the Iron Fangs, had never backed down from a challenge before. His gang thrived on fear, control, and dominance. They had terrorized countless small businesses in the area, shaking down shop owners for protection money. No one had ever dared to stand up to them. But tonight, someone had. And not just anyone, Keanu Reeves. The movie star, the legend, the man who had spent decades playing heroes on screen, now stood inches away from Axel, his expression unreadable, his stance relaxed but dangerously unshaken. Axel sneered, glancing at his crew. You believe this guy? He laughed, though there was something uneasy in his tone. Big-time movie star walks in here and thinks he's a vigilant. He turned back to Keanu, sizing him up. What's the matter, Reeves? You looking for a real-life action scene? Keanu said nothing. His silence was louder than words. The onlookers, Martha, the terrified shopkeepers peeking from across the street, and even some of the customers in the cafe next door, held their breath. Something was about to happen. Something big. The first move. Axel's smirk widened. He was testing Keanu, pushing for a reaction. He had dealt with men who tried to act tough before, and usually they'd folded as soon as the real danger presented itself. So he decided to push harder. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for a metal rod from the counter, the one Martha had used to hold up a decorative pastry stand. He twirled it between his fingers, the metallic clang against his rings echoing through the room. You know, it'd be real easy for me to mess up that pretty face of yours, he murmured. Keanu still didn't react. Axel scowled. He hated that. Hated the calm, the patience. It made him feel like he wasn't in control. So he swung the rod. It happened fast. The metal bar cut through the air, aiming for Keanu's ribs. But Keanu was faster. In one fluid, almost effortless motion, Keanu sidestepped, grabbed Axel's wrist, and twisted. A loud surayakeke rang through the bakery as the rod clattered to the floor. Axel stumbled, his wrist bent at an unnatural angle. The gang froze. Martha gasped. And Keanu. He hadn't even broken a sweat. Axel clutched his wrist, rage and disbelief flickering across his face. He had underestimated him. Bad move. The gang strikes back. Axel snarled. You little. Before he could finish, two of his men lunged at Keanu. The first swung a fist toward his head. Keanu ducked, moving like liquid, his reflexes honed by years of training. The punch whizzed past him, and in the same motion, Keanu planted his foot against the biker's knee, sending him collapsing to the floor. The second biker grabbed a chair, lifting it high over his head. Keanu stepped forward, gripped the chair legs midair, and yanked it away with an ease that made the biker stumble. Then, in one smooth motion, he spun the chair around and slammed it into the biker's chest, knocking him flat on his back. By now, the remaining bikers hesitated. They had never seen anything like this before. Their gang was used to winning fights before they even started. Most shop owners were too scared to resist. But this wasn't a normal night. And Keanu Reeves wasn't a normal man. Martha's shock and resolve. Martha stood behind the counter, hands trembling, unable to believe what she was witnessing. For weeks, she had lived in fear, knowing that one day, the threats from the Iron Fangs would go beyond broken windows and stolen cash. She had prayed for a miracle, never imagining that it would come in the form of Keanu Reeves. And now, as she watched him, standing like a lone warrior in the middle of her tiny bakery, facing down the gang that had terrorized her for months, something inside her changed. She was done being afraid. With a deep breath, she grabbed a rolling pin from the counter and stepped forward. "You get out of my store," she said, her voice firmer than she ever thought possible. Axel, still holding his injured wrist, looked at her with a mix of disbelief and fury. "You think this is over?" he growled. His eyes darted to Keanu, filled with burning rage and humiliated pride. "You made a mistake, Reeves." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Did I?" Axel's nostrils flared. He pointed a shaking finger at Martha. "This place. It's done. You're done." Then he turned to Keanu, eyes narrowing. "And you? You just made yourself an enemy." Keanu didn't even blink. He simply took a step forward, standing toe-to-toe with Axel. "Let me give you some advice," Keanu said, his voice steady. "Walk away. Tonight. Because if you ever come back here, if you ever touch this bakery again." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough for Axel alone to hear. "You won't like what happens next." For a split second, Axel hesitated. Because in that moment, looking into Keanu Reeves' eyes, he knew something most people didn't. Keanu wasn't just some movie star. He was a man who had trained for years in combat, a man who had endured real loss, real hardship, a man who didn't need cameras rolling to be dangerous. Axel swallowed hard. Then, with a sharp nod to his men, he turned and stormed out of the bakery. His gang followed, limping, cursing, throwing final glares at Keanu and Martha before disappearing into the night. The aftermath. And a new beginning. For a long moment, the bakery was silent. Then Martha let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Keanu turned to her. "You okay?" She nodded, though her hands still shook slightly. I think so." A small smile tugged at Keanu's lips. "Good." Then, as if nothing had happened, he glanced toward the counter. "You still got any coffee?" Martha blinked. Then she laughed. It wasn't just a laugh of relief. It was a laugh of strength, of reclaiming her space, of knowing that for the first time in a long time, she was safe. And as she poured Keanu a fresh cup of coffee, she realized something else. Tonight hadn't just been the night trouble arrived. It had been the night trouble was sent packing, and it was all thanks to one man. The moon had long disappeared, swallowed by the deep ink of the night sky, but Martha's sweet haven still glowed, the golden light from inside flickering onto the quiet street. The bakery, though small, had become the site of something far greater than anyone could have predicted. Inside, the air was still thick with the tension from earlier. Keanu Reeves sat at the counter, sipping on a hot cup of coffee, while Martha, her hands steadier now, cleaned up the remnants of the mess the Iron Fangs had left behind. But the night wasn't over. Because just as Martha was beginning to breathe freely again, just as the warmth of safety began settling into her tired bones, something sinister was happening elsewhere. The Iron Fangs gather, and they want blood. Across town, in the back of a dimly lit biker bar known as The Pit, Axel nursed his injured wrist while a storm of rage brewed inside him. The place reeked of motor oil, sweat, and stale beer, but it had always been their territory, their safe house. Tonight, though, Axel's ego was bruised worse than his body. He had spent years building fear in this town, ensuring that every business knew better than to defy him. No one had ever dared to stand up to the Iron Fangs. Not the police, not shopkeepers, not even local tough guys. But Keanu Reeves had. And in front of his men, no less. That was unacceptable. Axel slammed his beer onto the table, the glass rattling as his men sat around him, watching, waiting. That son of a... Axel's voice was low, dangerous, and venomous. Do you know what just happened tonight? Do you know what the hell we just let happen? His second in command, Jace, leaned forward, flicking his cigarette into an ashtray. We let some Hollywood pretty boy make us look like fools, he muttered. Axel's jaw clenched. Damn right we did. He looked at each of his men, fire in his eyes. And what happens when word gets out? Huh. His fist slammed the table. What happens when every damn store owner in town thinks they can just stand up to us now? What happens when they stop paying? The room was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on the gang like lead. Axel leaned back, his face darkening. We send a message that no one, not even a damn movie star, messes with the Iron Fangs. Jace smirked. So what's the plan, boss? Axel grinned, the kind of grin that made grown men uneasy. We burn that bakery to the ground. A warning in the dark. Back at Martha's, the night had turned peaceful. Keanu had finished his coffee, helping Martha lock up before stepping outside. I can't thank you enough, Martha said softly, pulling her cardigan tighter around herself as the night air cooled. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't walked in when you did. Keanu gave her a small smile, his eyes warm but watchful. You don't have to thank me. No one should have to deal with what they put you through. Martha nodded, but a flicker of worry crossed her face. But they're not just going to give up, are they? Keanu's expression grew more serious. He had faced men like the Iron Fangs before, people who thrived on power and control, people who didn't like losing. And Axel had lost. No, Keanu admitted after a pause. They're not done. Martha swallowed hard, the reality of the situation sinking in. Just then, the distant roar of a motorcycle engine cut through the silence. Then another, and another. Keanu's eyes flicked to the street, his body instinctively tensing. 3 bikes idled on the corner, their riders half hidden in shadow. Watching. Waiting. Martha shivered, gripping Keanu's arm. They're back. Keanu's gaze didn't waver, but he didn't react with fear, only resolve. He placed a reassuring hand on Martha's. Go inside. Lock the doors. But Keanu, I'll handle it. Martha hesitated, but there was something about the way he said it, calm, unwavering, absolute, that made her listen. She stepped back inside, locking the door with trembling fingers. Keanu took a deep breath and stepped off the curb, straight toward the bikes. The first threat. The lead biker, a burly man with sleeve tattoos and a black bandana, revved his engine as Keanu approached. Brave move, walking right up to us, the biker mused, his voice coated in amusement. Keanu stopped a few feet away, his stance relaxed, hands in his pockets. If you've got something to say, say it. The second biker, leaner, meaner looking, let out a sharp chuckle. Boss says this ain't over. Says you made a big mistake. Keanu tilted his head slightly. Did I? The first biker's smirk faltered slightly, but he recovered. We ain't leaving town. And neither is your little old lady friend's bakery. Keanu's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. That bakery has been in this town longer than any of you. You think you can scare her into running. The third biker, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. His voice was low, gravelly, and laced with warning. We're not trying to scare her, he murmured. We're gonna burn it down. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. But Keanu didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his voice dropping just slightly. You're going to walk away, he said. The bikers laughed. Keanu didn't move, didn't blink. "You're going to tell Axel this is over," Keanu continued, his voice eerily calm. "Because if you don't, if any of you so much as touch that bakery." The silence was deafening. And then Keanu leaned in just slightly, dropping his voice lower. "I will end every last one of you." The lead biker's smirk disappeared. Because in that moment, he saw it, not the actor, not the Hollywood legend, but the man. The man who had trained for years in martial arts. The man who had endured real suffering. The man who wasn't just saying words. He was making a promise. The biker swallowed hard, his fingers twitching over his throttle. Then, without another word, he turned his bike around. One by one, the others followed. Keanu watched them disappear down the street, his expression unreadable. And only then, as the night air settled once more, did he finally exhale. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Because if Keanu knew anything, it was this. Men like Axel didn't know how to walk away. And the real fight hadn't even started yet. The night the Iron Fangs went too far, the quiet after the storm lingered in the air like a brewing hurricane, heavy and expectant. The Iron Fangs may have ridden away, but their promise of retaliation was a poison that seeped into the night, thick with unspoken threats. Inside Martha's sweet haven, the bakery's warm glow no longer felt comforting. It felt like a beacon waiting to be struck down. Martha sat at one of the small wooden tables, her hands wrapped around a cup of now cold tea, her fingers trembling slightly as the weight of the situation sank in. Keanu stood near the front window, watching the street, his silhouette sharp against the dim light. His hands were shoved deep into his jacket pockets, but his entire body was on edge, alert, and waiting. He had seen men like Axel before, men who thrived on fear, who couldn't stand losing, who always came back to reclaim what they thought was theirs. And tonight, Keanu knew they were coming back. The only question was when. A long night ahead. Martha sighed, setting her cup down with a soft clink. "You scared them off, Keanu," she said, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. "Do you really think they'll come back?" Keanu turned to her, his dark eyes calm but unwavering. "I don't think," he said softly. "I know." Martha swallowed hard. "What are we supposed to do? Call the police?" Keanu exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "Cops won't get here in time if they come at night," he admitted. "And even if they did, guys like Axel don't play fair. They'll wait until the bakery is empty. Until no one's around to stop them." Martha tightened her grip on the table's edge. This was her life, her dream. And now, a group of thugs wanted to rip it away from her like it meant nothing. Keanu watched her, reading the quiet resolve in her tired eyes. She had been fighting for so long, but now she had someone fighting with her. "We're not going to let that happen," Keanu said, his voice a steady anchor in the rising tide of fear. Martha took a breath. "Then what do we do?" Keanu glanced out the window again. The street was empty. Too empty. "We wait." The flames that started everything. Hours passed, and the town slipped into slumber. The bakery remained a lone island of light in an ocean of darkness, the neon sign flickering against the cracked pavement outside. Keanu leaned against the counter, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the front entrance. He wasn't tired. His instincts wouldn't let him be. Years of discipline had trained him to be hyper-aware, to listen, to feel the shifts in the air before danger even showed itself. And then, a noise. It was faint, but Keanu heard it instantly. A shuffle. The crunch of gravel beneath heavy boots. Then, glass breaking. Martha's head shot up, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Keanu was already moving. Silent. Controlled, precise. He motioned for her to stay put as he slipped toward the back door, his body tense with focus. And then, the scent of smoke hit his nose. A flash of orange reflected against the windows. Martha gasped. "Oh my God!" Keanu turned sharply and saw it. A wall of fire licking up the side of the bakery's back door. The iron fangs had set the building on fire. The battle begins. The heat intensified instantly, the flames licking hungrily at the wooden frame of the bakery. Smoke billowed in thick, choking clouds, curling into the air like a demon unfurling its claws. Martha coughed, eyes watering as panic gripped her chest. Keanu moved fast. He grabbed a fire extinguisher from behind the counter, pulling the pin with practiced ease before spraying down the flames, creating a temporary barrier against the growing inferno. But it wouldn't be enough. The fire was spreading too fast. And outside, they were waiting. Through the smoke, Keanu caught sight of shadows shifting beyond the flames, figures standing just outside the glow of the fire, watching, waiting for them to run out. Axel's voice rang out. "Come out, Reeves. Let's settle this the old-fashioned way." Keanu clenched his jaw. He had been right. They never planned to leave quietly. "Martha," Keanu said, his voice calm despite the rising chaos. "We need to get you out of here. Now." Martha looked at him, fear etched deep into her face. "They'll kill us." Keanu's eyes hardened. "They'll try." Then, without hesitation, he grabbed a damp cloth from the sink and handed it to her. "Cover your mouth. Stay low. Follow me." Martha nodded, gripping his arm as they moved. Keanu led her toward the front, where the fire hadn't reached yet. He peeked out the side window. The gang was positioned near the back, waiting for them to flee from the fire. They weren't expecting Keanu to come straight for them. Perfect. Keanu's counterattack. With one swift motion, Keanu kicked open the front door, his movements quick and calculated. The gang, caught off guard, turned sharply, but by the time they realized what was happening, Keanu was already in motion. The first biker, Jace, never even saw the hit coming. Keanu pivoted sharply, driving a precise elbow strike into Jace's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. As Jace doubled over, Keanu used the momentum to grab the back of his jacket and slam him into the side of a parked motorcycle. The second biker lunged, swinging a crowbar. Keanu ducked, the metal whistling over his head. He grabbed the biker's arm, twisting it at an impossible angle, and with a sharp kick to the knee, sent him sprawling onto the pavement. The others hesitated. Axel, however, wasn't afraid. He stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. Finally, he sneered. A real fight. Keanu rolled his shoulders. His face was calm, unreadable. "You sure?" Axel growled, launching forward. And Keanu moved. Axel swung, but Keanu sidestepped effortlessly, his movements faster, smoother, sharper than Axel could anticipate. Before Axel could recover, Keanu landed a precise strike to his chest, knocking him backward. The gang leader stumbled, coughing, glaring up at Keanu. But Keanu wasn't finished. With one final devastating roundhouse kick, he sent Axel crashing into a pile of trash cans, his body crumpling in a heap. Silence. The remaining bikers stared, wide-eyed. They knew. They had lost. Keanu stepped forward, towering over Axel's battered form. His voice was deadly quiet. "This ends tonight." Axel spat blood onto the pavement, but the fight in his eyes was gone. He knew he had no choice. He nodded stiffly, and with what little dignity he had left, he staggered to his feet. One by one, the iron fangs mounted their bikes, revving their engines before peeling away into the night. And just like that, they were gone. Martha exhaled, tears brimming in her eyes. You did it." Keanu turned to her, offering the smallest of smiles. "We did it." Martha let out a shaky laugh, wiping her face. The bakery stood, battered but unbroken, just like them. And as the first hints of dawn painted the sky, Keanu knew one thing for certain. They would never come back. The first light of dawn crept over Oakwood, casting a golden hue on the remnants of the night's battle. Smoke still curled in the air from the small fire that had licked at the bakery's back wall, leaving charred edges and blackened bricks, but the structure stood. It stood because Keanu Reeves had stood. And now, as the dust settled and the iron fangs had vanished into the shadows, a different kind of movement began to stir in the quiet town. Something was changing. For the first time in a long time, people weren't just watching from behind closed doors. They were stepping out. Because Keanu hadn't just protected one small bakery. He had woken up an entire town. A community awakens. The morning air was cool and crisp, but the people of Oakwood were already out on the streets. Shopkeepers, small business owners, and longtime residents, all of whom had, for too long, lived under the quiet fear of the Iron Fang's grip, began gathering in front of Martha's sweet haven. Whispers turned to murmurs. Murmurs turned to conversations. And conversations turned to action. Someone brought out a bucket and mop, scrubbing away the soot from the bakery's back wall. Another carried new glass panes, ready to replace the shattered windows. An older gentleman, the owner of the hardware store down the street, arrived with fresh cans of paint. People weren't just helping to repair the damage. They were taking their town back. Martha stood in the middle of it all, her eyes filled with disbelief and gratitude. After years of feeling alone in this fight, she was now surrounded by people who had once been too scared to act, but not anymore. Keanu, standing beside her, arms crossed, watched with a small, knowing smile. "You started something last night," Martha said, glancing at him. "Something bigger than just this bakery." Keanu shook his head. "No, Martha. You did. I just reminded them what they already knew deep down, that they don't have to be afraid anymore." Martha looked around, watching shopkeepers shake hands, old neighbors exchange relieved smiles, and young workers roll up their sleeves to pitch in. A lump formed in her throat. Maybe the Iron Fangs hadn't just lost a fight. Maybe they had lost everything. The press arrives, and the story goes public. By mid-morning, word had spread beyond the small town. The attack on Martha's bakery, Keanu's intervention, and the town's defiant stand against the Iron Fangs had exploded onto social media. People had filmed the events, clips of Keanu facing off against the bikers, images of the fire, footage of the town uniting. Within hours, it was everywhere. Local reporters rushed to the scene, microphones and cameras capturing the story as it unfolded. Martha Caldwell, the owner of this beloved bakery, has been a staple in this town for over 40 years. A young reporter spoke into the camera, standing just outside the freshly repaired entrance. Last night, she was targeted by a violent biker gang that has long extorted local businesses, but what they didn't count on was Keanu Reeves stepping in to defend her. The footage cut to Keanu, calm as ever, standing near the bakery's entrance, arms folded, eyes unreadable. "Mr. Reeves," a journalist called out, "can you tell us what happened last night?" Keanu glanced at Martha, then back at the reporter. "I think it's pretty simple," he said, voice steady. "A good person needed help, and I wasn't about to stand by and do nothing." The journalist pressed on. "Were you scared, going up against a known criminal gang?" Keanu's lips twitched with a faint smile. "Not even a little." The crowd laughed, the tension lifting slightly. But the journalist wasn't done. "What do you think this means for the town? Do you think the Iron Fangs will retaliate?" A murmur of unease passed through the gathered residents, the unspoken fear still lingering in the air. Keanu took his time before answering, looking around at the people who had come together in the wake of destruction. "They can try," he said finally. "But I don't think they'll find the same town they thought they could intimidate before." The townspeople cheered, the weight of fear slowly lifting from their shoulders. Because Keanu was right. They weren't the same town anymore. The unexpected call that changed everything. Later that afternoon, as the news spread far and wide, Martha sat at the front of her bakery, watching the sun glisten off the newly repaired window. The place felt alive again. Keanu sat across from her, sipping another cup of coffee, when Martha's old rotary phone rang sharply. She frowned. It had been a long time since she'd gotten a call on that line. Hesitantly, she picked it up. "Hello." There was a long pause. Then, a deep, familiar voice crackled through the line. "Martha, it's Axel." Keanu's posture shifted instantly. Martha's fingers tightened on the receiver. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady, but her pulse racing. A sigh. Then, "I'm done, Martha." She blinked. "What?" "I lost half my crew," Axel admitted, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it before. "The ones that ran. They're not coming back. The others? They don't want to fight anymore. This whole town's against us now." Martha glanced at Keanu, who listened intently, expression unreadable. Axel continued. "I called to tell you. I'm out. I'm leaving town. The Iron Fangs. They're done." Silence stretched between them. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Axel added, "You win." Martha didn't move for a long moment, her mind reeling. Then, finally, she exhaled, nodding to herself. "Good," she said simply. "Now stay gone." A dry chuckle. "Yeah, I think I will." The call ended. Martha set the phone down, her fingers trembling. But this time, not from fear. From relief. She turned to Keanu, who had watched the entire exchange with careful, silent observation. "They're leaving," she murmured, still in disbelief. "It's over." Keanu held her gaze for a long moment. Then he smiled. And for the first time in what felt like forever, so did Martha. Because for once, evil hadn't won. This time, good had. The reward no one expected, Keanu's final surprise for the town. The sun was beginning its slow descent over Oakwood, casting long golden rays that painted the town in warm hues. The air smelled of fresh bread and pastries as Martha's sweet haven reopened its doors. This time, without fear. The Iron Fangs were gone. Their leader, Axel, had made it clear over the phone. They had lost, and they weren't coming back. The gang had always relied on intimidation, feeding off the silence of a town too scared to fight back. But after last night, Oakwood wasn't scared anymore. The bakery was alive with energy, bustling with customers who had come not just to buy pastries, but to celebrate the victory they never thought possible. And at the center of it all, sitting at the corner table as if he were just another regular customer, was Keanu Reeves, the man who had started it all. A celebration of strength. Inside the bakery, the sound of laughter and conversation filled the air. It was a stark contrast to the fear and silence that had once gripped the place. Now, people gathered in groups, sharing stories about the night before, talking about how their town had changed in less than 24 hours. Martha stood behind the counter, her flour-dusted hands gripping a tray of warm cinnamon rolls. She looked out at the crowd, at the people who had once lived in quiet fear, now reclaiming their home. She couldn't stop smiling. It wasn't just the fact that the Iron Fangs were gone. It was the realization that people had come together, that they had stood up for something bigger than themselves. And it was because of Keanu. She turned toward his table, watching as he sipped his coffee, calm and content, as if he hadn't just taken on an entire biker gang the night before. Martha wiped her hands on her apron and walked over, setting down a plate in front of him. "On the house," she said with a smirk. Keanu raised an eyebrow, looking down at the perfectly arranged blueberry scones and butter croissants. He chuckled, setting his coffee down. "Martha, you don't have to do that." "Oh, I do," she said firmly. "And if you argue, I'll make it 2 plates." Keanu laughed, shaking his head. "Well, in that case, I surrender." Martha sat down across from him, her expression softening. "You don't understand what you did, Keanu," she said after a moment. "This isn't just about my bakery. It's about this town. You gave them back their courage." Keanu shook his head slightly, taking a bite of the croissant. "They always had it," he said after a pause. "They just needed someone to remind them." Martha studied him for a long moment. "You don't take credit for much, do you?" Keanu smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Not my style." Martha chuckled, shaking her head. This man, this quiet, humble man, had done more for this town in one night than anyone had in years. And yet, he was sitting here eating pastries like it was just another morning. But before she could say more, the front door swung open. The mayor's unexpected arrival. A hush fell over the bakery as Mayor Charles Whitmore stepped inside, followed closely by his assistant and 2 town officials. Martha's eyes widened. She had met Whitmore before. He had always been polite but distant, more of a figurehead than a leader. But now he looked different, determined, focused, and for the first time, present. The mayor scanned the room, his gaze immediately landing on Keanu, who had turned in his seat but remained calm and composed, as if he had been expecting this. Whitmore walked toward him, extending his hand. "Mr. Reeves," he said, his voice firm but warm. "I believe I owe you more than just a handshake." Keanu stood, taking his hand in a firm grip. "Just Keanu," he corrected with a small smile. The mayor nodded, looking around at the bustling bakery. "I've been mayor of this town for 8 years, he began, his voice carrying weight. "And in all that time, I have never seen the people of Oakwood come together like this." He turned toward the crowd, who watched with anticipation. "You changed that. You changed everything." A murmur of agreement rippled through the bakery. Keanu, however, simply shrugged. "It wasn't just me," he said, glancing at Martha and the others. "They were ready to fight for their town. I just helped give them the push." The mayor's expression grew serious. "That may be, but I'd be a fool if I didn't recognize what you've done here." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Martha gasped. She knew what it was. The Oakwood Medal of Honor. It was only given to those who had made an extraordinary contribution to the community. The mayor opened the box, revealing the golden medallion, the town's insignia gleaming under the bakery lights. "Keanu Reeves," the mayor said, his voice steady, "for your bravery, your selflessness, and your unwavering stand against injustice, I present you with the highest honor Oakwood can give." The bakery erupted into cheers. Keanu's eyes flicked toward the medal, then back to the crowd. He looked almost uncomfortable. Then, after a long pause, he smiled. The gift no one expected. Later that evening, as the excitement settled and the bakery finally closed its doors, Keanu sat with Martha one last time. The medal sat on the counter between them, untouched. "You're not gonna keep it, are you?" Martha asked, smirking. Keanu chuckled, shaking his head. "I never did this for a medal." He pushed it toward her. "This belongs to the town." Martha sighed. "You really are something else, Keanu." Keanu smiled, finishing the last sip of his coffee. Then, his expression grew more serious. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small envelope and placed it in front of her. Martha frowned. "What is this?" Keanu gestured for her to open it. With hesitant fingers, she peeled back the flap, pulling out a piece of folded paper. As she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. A bank check. Made out to her. For $250,000. Martha stared in shock. "Keanu, what?" "I made a few calls this morning," he said, his voice gentle. "This town needs its businesses strong. And I figure, if Martha's Sweet Haven is going to be a symbol of what Oakwood stands for, then you should be able to keep it running without worry." Martha covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "Keanu, I can't accept this." Keanu simply smiled. "You already did." Martha laughed through her tears, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're unbelievable." Keanu leaned back, his smile widening. "I've heard that before. The legacy left behind. How one night changed everything forever." The morning after Oakwood's fight for freedom wasn't just a new day. It was the beginning of a new era. The once quiet town, which had spent years living in the shadow of fear, had been transformed overnight. The iron fangs were gone. Martha's Sweet Haven was stronger than ever. And most importantly, the people of Oakwood had reclaimed their home. But this wasn't just about one fight. It was about what came after, about how the people of Oakwood would carry this newfound strength forward, about how one man's actions had left behind something far greater than himself. And as the sun climbed higher, spilling golden light over the town's freshly repainted storefronts and bustling sidewalks, one thing became clear: Keanu Reeves had changed this town forever. The town that refused to be afraid again. The morning felt different. For the first time in years, shopkeepers opened their doors without fear of who might come knocking. The people who once kept their heads down and avoided eye contact now greeted each other with pride, with confidence. Oakwood was no longer a town that waited to be saved. It was a town that had learned to fight back. And at the heart of it all, Martha's Sweet Haven stood as a symbol, a reminder that even the smallest place, even the most unassuming person, could spark a revolution. Inside, Martha moved behind the counter, rolling out fresh dough, her hands steady and sure. There was a new energy in her bakery now, one that hadn't existed before. People didn't just come here for pastries anymore. They came for a story, for a piece of something bigger than themselves. A woman in her late 40s approached the counter, a hesitant smile on her face. "Miss Caldwell." Martha looked up, brushing flour from her hands. "That's me." The woman glanced around the bustling shop, then leaned in slightly. "I own a bookstore down the street," she said softly. "For years, I've been paying protection fees to keep them from wrecking my store." She swallowed. "But last night, when I saw you standing tall, when I saw Keanu take them down, I realized something. I don't have to be afraid anymore." Martha's heart swelled. "That's right, dear," she said, her voice warm and steady. "None of us do." And for the first time in a long time, the woman smiled without fear. Keanu's quiet departure. While the town bustled with newfound strength, Keanu Reeves had other plans. Standing outside the bakery, he adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, taking one last look at the place he had helped save. The warm smell of cinnamon and coffee wafted through the air, mixing with the scent of fresh paint from the newly repaired walls. He smiled. It felt right. Leaving now, while everything was whole again. He had never been the type to linger. Martha sensed it before she even saw him. Stepping out onto the sidewalk, she crossed her arms, eyeing him knowingly. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Keanu smirked slightly. "You make it sound like I was ever staying." Martha sighed, shaking her head. "I suppose I should have expected this. You ride into town, save the day, then vanish like a ghost." Keanu chuckled. "I wouldn't say ghost." Martha studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Where to next?" He shrugged, glancing toward the road. "Wherever I'm needed." Martha exhaled through her nose. Then suddenly, her expression softened. She reached behind her apron and pulled something out, a small paper bag, tied with twine. "For the road," she said, pressing it into his hands. Keanu looked down at it, then back at her. "You didn't have to." "Hush," Martha cut in. "It's not much, but it's my way of saying thank you." Keanu smiled, tucking the bag into his duffel. "Then I'll take it." Martha hesitated, then placed a hand on his arm. "You really did change this town, you know." Keanu's gaze softened. "No, Martha. You did. I just helped remind them what they already knew deep down." Martha shook her head, but smiled. "I hope you know you'll always have a home here." Keanu nodded. "I appreciate that." And with that, he turned toward the street, where a black vintage motorcycle waited, one that had been parked there since the night before. He swung his leg over, settling onto the seat before revving the engine. Martha watched as he pulled down his sunglasses, looking every bit the mysterious wanderer that he was. With one last nod, he rolled forward, the roar of the engine fading into the distance. And just like that, he was gone. But his legacy remained, a name that would never be forgotten. As the weeks passed, Martha's Sweet Haven flourished. The bakery became more than just a shop. It became a symbol of defiance, of unity, of strength. People came from all over, some just to take pictures, others to hear the story firsthand. The mayor even commissioned a plaque to be placed outside, right next to the front door. It read, "Asterisk, asterisk, this bakery stands today as a testament to courage and community, to Martha Caldwell for her unwavering strength, and to a traveler who reminded us that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear leather jackets and ride motorcycles. Thank you, Keanu Reeves." The town would never forget, and neither would Martha. Because even though Keanu had left without a word, he had done something no one else had ever done before. He had made Oakwood believe in itself again. And that was the greatest gift of all.